Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. Welcome to the forum. It's so good to be back and back underway. I've been looking forward to this one in particular, this forum conversation. In the summer of last year, we were talking about what our theme would be for Grace Cathedral in 2018, and we decided that the truth was going to be our theme. And we were realizing that people don't just have different positions, different prescriptions for how to solve particular problems. People disagree on whether the problems even exist. And so there is a conflict over just basic facts, basic science. And when it comes to major public policy decisions, it's especially important. So this week for Earth Day, we wanted to have Maurice Hall, who's an expert in water. So we have a lot of questions for him. We also have today, to celebrate Earth Day, our first day when the steps are covered with a waterfall. So Sukey Bryan is our artist in residence, and she is an extraordinary visual artist. Some of you may have come in the California sides and not seen it, but before you leave, you've got to check out the front steps of the cathedral because it's an amazing installation. So I'd like all of us to welcome Maurice Hall to the forum. I was telling someone just a minute ago, I spent 9 hours at a Sunday school teacher training yesterday. I wasn't responsible for anything, I was just learning. But it really made me sensitive to just, how children experience the world. And I remember just that smell of the rain when it fell on hot pavement when I was a boy. And I was wondering if you have any memories of just water from your childhood. What did you think of when you thought of water? Or if that's just totally immaterial to your present day life?
No, it's, well, first of all, it's a real treat to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's a real honor to be in this special place talking with thoughtful people about water. Life doesn't get much better than that. And interestingly, as I think about how I developed this interest in water, I think of my youth in I was in elementary school in central North Carolina, the Piedmont area of North Carolina, about 70 miles east of Charlotte. Probably never heard of the little town of Wadesboro, but there was a little creek right behind our house, and it wasn't one of these beautiful bubbling brooks that you think of when you've been to Yosemite or the Sierras. It was, now that I've studied these things, I know that it was deeply incised and it was carrying lots of sediment from poor land use practices and things, but it was so close to our house. It was right out the back door, and it was a great place to play. And I spent a lot of my youth, those years when I was there, playing in that creek, and I can remember so many different things that I observed that I got to study later in my college and in my practice experience. I can even remember seeing the dramatic changes through time in the creek, in those winter storms when it seems like it rains forever in February if you've been in the southeast in the winter, and the creek is just rolling. And then after the water subsided, you go to see how the gravel bars have moved and how the banks have eroded, and every so often a new tree would fall into the little creek. Even that tiny little creek would move enough sediment to uproot a tree. And then late in August, in those sweltering Augusts in Tennessee, in North Carolina, the little creek was still running. And I remember wondering, how in the world is that little creek still running? And so my intellectual curiosity being spurred, one day I followed that little creek upstream to see where this water was coming from. I'm sure much to my mom's dismay, I crawled through some culverts, even under some of the main roads, because I knew I wasn't supposed to cross the main roads. Spider webs, and it's kind of surprising I didn't run into some snakes. But I went a ways and eventually came to the end of the stream there where there was a little seep, not much more than a seep, emerging in the middle of a hayfield, a little clump of bushes around it. And I suppose, thinking back on it, that was my first sort of experience with groundwater. Emerging from the land, and turns out that groundwater has been a really big part of my career in practice in the last several
What
years.
is groundwater? And how does it, like, how's the field broken down, and how did you find yourself doing this work?
Well, groundwater is certainly that part of the water system that is most out of sight and out of mind, and until recently it was very much out of sight and out of mind in California, although it's a really important part of our water supply. So groundwater is basically the water that's in the pores and the cracks in the ground. Sometimes if it's a hard rock, like in the Sierras, the groundwater only flows in small little cracks in the rock. But in California, most of the groundwater that we use, and that's most important in our water supply system anyway, is in these, what we call alluvial valleys. So if you're in California and you're standing in a flat valley and there's mountains or hills around you, you can almost bet that underneath you is groundwater, water in the pores between the sediments. Sometimes it's gravel, sometimes it's sand, sometimes it's cobbles, and sometimes it's clay. But there's water in those pores. And in California, we have lots of big valleys. The Salinas Valley, the Central Valley, of course, the granddaddy of them all, and up along the Russian River, Alexander Valley. Right. So all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of these valleys where there are aquifers that hold groundwater. And for many years, and even thousands of years, we've been digging wells and taking that groundwater out. It wasn't really until the 1940s and 50s when certain types of pumps began to be produced that we really began producing groundwater. And now in California, groundwater, pumping water out of wells from the ground, is 30 to 50% of our water supply, according to how dry it is and how much water there is flowing in our streams. In addition to it being part of our water supply directly from the wells, groundwater and our surface water in our streams are connected. And pumping groundwater from a groundwater aquifer really ends up meaning there's less water in the stream. Sometimes it induces flow into the groundwater to replenish it, and sometimes the groundwater is the source of part of the stream flow, and when you pump it and you lower the groundwater levels, less of that groundwater flows into the stream.
How do you measure where the groundwater is, or what our stock is of groundwater?
Well, the way you pay attention to groundwater and you measure it and observe it is really it's pretty restricted. You can't see down there, and so most of what we see is through wells. And when we drill a well, we hopefully will collect the sediment or the chips of the rock, if it's in a hard rock, that we dig out as we're drilling the well, and we monitor that. And so we know that at this area, maybe this level it was sediment, this level it was sand, this level it was gravel, this level it was sand again. And those well logs, we call them, tell us what the aquifer looks like, which also tells us how the water is likely to move through the groundwater. And then after we put a well in, those well levels are the best indicator of, in many cases, the only indicator of what the water condition in the aquifer is. And so we measure those well levels across large areas, and then we use computer models, in many cases, to simulate how the groundwater is flowing and see if it matches up to the levels in those wells. So it's a combination of observations of water levels in wells and behaviors in wells, and sometimes computer modeling that helps us to understand more specifics about what's going on.
There are so many valleys here, and I hadn't thought of just kind of like the topography of South Africa, which is facing such a serious drought and such a serious water crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there? I mean, this day zero that they're approaching in terms of just running out of city water supplies?
Yeah, the situation in Cape Town, South Africa really does have a lot of important signals for us here in California. For one thing, it's a Mediterranean environment. It's one of a Mediterranean climate. It's one of the 4 areas in the world where we have this Mediterranean climate, like we do from this point south in California, where we have wet winters and very dry summers. And even among the years, there's a high variability in the amount of rainfall that we get. Similar situation in Cape Town. And they depend on water supply primarily from reservoirs, and they simply haven't had much rain in a while. Estimates I've heard say it's a 1 in 600 year event. That said, in the context of climate change, that meaning is a little less valuable than it used to be, but it's a pretty rare event. That said, just a couple of years ago, we finished the worst drought on our record of 150 years or so of record, and indications are we have had similarly worse droughts in California in the past, and again, with climate change, we can anticipate those in the future. So the signals from South Africa are really important for us to pay attention to. We have some advantages in dealing with that sort of crisis in California over South Africa, and I think one of the biggest advantages is that we have some really thoughtful people paying attention to our water supply. In general, especially our urban water agencies in California are some of the most sophisticated water supply agencies in the world. You have the benefit here in San Francisco of San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, East Bay Municipal Utility District, although may not agree with everything they've done. Really sharp folks, really sharp professionals planning for a long-term water future. And so they have developed a portfolio of tools to try and address the variability that we can expect, the variability that we've seen, and looking down the road at climate change, how are we going to adapt? That said, it's certainly not unreasonable that we will see times when more austere conservation and reduction in water use are going to be needed. From one of the things that we work on, of course, at Environmental Defense Fund is how does the water show up for the environment? And in this last drought, 2015, 2016, there were periods where cutbacks in water were required by the state board, State Water Resources Control Board, which has the authority over the flows in the rivers and streams. And in fact, we had fairly poor information on which to judge how to cut that water back. And one of the things that happened was environmental conditions were severely impacted. We have certain runs of fish in certain streams that we feel like probably didn't have any fish reproduced that year. And so to adjust to this change in climate going forward, we have to be much more thoughtful and much more proactive about recognizing what the different water needs are, recognizing the variability that we're almost certain to see with climate change, and ensuring that we plan for a resilient water supply, a water supply that's able to adapt to those changing conditions in a thoughtful way so that we don't have unanticipated impacts, so that we've planned to do things in a smart way and avoid those accidental
so interesting that the political culture, climate has such an effect on those decisions. It's just that's not been the way I've read the situation. We've talked so much about climate change. I mean, it's so much on our mind, and I wonder if you have an idea why. I mean, to me, it's strange that it's controversial. I mean, 97% of the scientists agree that human actions is causing massive changes to our climate. And so why do you think it is that's a controversial? It's controversial to state the facts about climate change. Like, where have we gotten in terms of our approach to truth and facts that got us to this point?
Yeah, well, that's it's. Lots has been written about this, of course, and this is not my particular area of expertise, but people really, really want to believe what supports the way they've been doing things. In water management, people have been doing things through time, and it's sort of hard to believe that you need to change. Yeah. And so if you can find information that supports your perspective and you're doing things the same way, you're going to want to believe that. And unfortunately, there's been enough, some people specialize in how to take advantage of that tendency. And in our water management response, there's been a tendency to say, these creeks, they used to go dry. It's really not that different from the way it used to be. And if you've been farming for 50 years or 100 years and your grandfather did this and your daddy did this, you really want to believe that you can continue going on in the future. That said, as you described, there really isn't any argument in the science community about climate change.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think so much about our climate. I mean, you talked about that Mediterranean climate. I mean, so much depends on these, like cold water, the ocean, the cold water in the ocean, the currents that come down from Alaska, down the west coast of Canada, and in the California high pressure area that sits off the coast of California. Have you heard anything about what effect climate change will have on those, you know, basic Earth processes? I mean, can you depend on the high pressure area to sit off the coast during summer times in the future?
In the best information we have about California and the Southwest is that climate change is probably not gonna make that much difference on the average precipitation. But our precipitation patterns are likely to be much more variable, which means our droughts are likely to be steeper and deeper and worse, and our floods are likely to be more frequent and worse. Now, that seems a little bit of a contradiction, but if you've seen just the last several years, you can see that in action, and those are, although fairly extreme by our short period of record, those types of things are anticipated to occur more and more frequently in the future. And it has really serious implications for how we supply our water. Another issue that plays into the water supply and climate change is the fact that temperatures are rising. And the biggest use of our water, both naturally and human uses, is through plant transpiration. Natural plants take some of the water out of the soil and transpire it, and then our incredible irrigated agriculture system in California depends on the plants pumping water out of the ground and evaporating into the air, and so we irrigate that. And so to grow the same crops in a hotter climate is going to take more water, and the natural vegetation is going to also use more water. And so all those combined factors mean that we have to plan for resilience in the future, build into our water management mechanisms to handle those extremes, thinking about it in advance.
Like, how do you do that? I mean, just you store up more water during the fat lean years and the lean years. You store up more water during the fat years, so that, you know, when you have the lean years, then you have some savings in the water storage facilities. Is that like what you're talking about, or what are other ways that we could make that resilience?
So that's definitely one tool. Right now, we do that on a pretty significant scale in California already to adapt to our we save water in the winter and in the wet years in reservoirs and release that when we need it during the summers and in drier years. But the reservoirs have only so much capacity.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, one of the biggest reservoirs we have now is the snowpack in the Sierras.
Yeah.
And that snowpack holds water and releases it over a period of months instead of over a period of days after a storm. And that's a really valuable storage, and we're going to lose part of that. So some of the strategies is we need to use groundwater better. You've probably heard of our passage of a Groundwater Management Act, the Sustainable
right.
Groundwater Management Act in 2014, which for the first time for much of California puts management in place over groundwater basins. Before that, we really weren't paying very much attention, and no one was sort of charged with managing those. But with someone managing the groundwater, it offers the opportunity to use these giant basins, 50 miles wide and thousands of feet deep in this case of the Central Valley, to store water. That said, we got to develop the methods, and we're testing them in different places to recharge groundwater during the wet periods so that we can store that water in these vast underground reservoirs to draw on in dry periods without having those impacts that I described before of affecting stream flows too much and drying up wetlands that depend on groundwater. Some of the other tools, and one of the things that the Environmental Defense Fund is really active in, is the idea of water trading or water transfers. Water trading has definitely gotten a bad rap, and good reason. We've done it pretty sloppily in the past in many cases, where we've moved water from one source to another and dried up agricultural communities, certainly dried up wetlands and natural habitats. But the ability to move water between different uses is a really good tool for this resilience that I was describing. It allows you to move water from one place to another, perhaps where someone has a little extra water, someone can do without water for a little while. And so building water trading programs that are smartly done with good analysis behind them so you know what the impacts are going to be and you shape it to avoid those impacts is undoubtedly going to be an important tool for adding this flexibility. But we have to do it right, and that's something that we spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out.
It sounds like, I mean, there's some just big changes in terms of just how you know, the tools that you have available and the technologies that you have. I mean, what other technologies have changed just like how you do your work in terms of water and how we manage water?
So one really dramatic change that has occurred in recent decades is the incredible increase in computer capacity and measurement analysis and the ability to get information from one place to another, like through small cell phones, et cetera. And it has allowed us to do some pretty impressive things already. And one of the most impressive things has been in the urban areas where you have really specific metering on houses and residents and businesses. And those meters allow you to better understand the water use practices and therefore provide incentives to change those practices to maximize your water efficiency. And we made great strides in those in urban areas. So taking those technologies to the next level, and in fact, our president, Fred Krupp, just announced last month, in an op-ed in the New York Times, a concept we're calling the fourth wave of environmentalism, which is using technology to improve and scale good practices dramatically. And so one of the things that we're working on, in fact, is there's long been methods to use satellite imagery to measure how much crops are using in irrigated landscapes. But that technology has been fairly small, used in fairly special situations where people have a lot of resources to access it. You can pay a consultant to do it, but it costs a lot of money. And so we are working in cooperation with some of the top technology folks in the field, including NASA, the Desert Research Institute, and University of Nevada, and Google's Earth Engine, to put that technology on a platform that allows much wider access.
So normal people would have access to remote sensing.
So farmers, irrigation district
Red
managers, et
Bluff,
cetera,
and
are able to access that and make better decisions about their water use.
So what's I like this fourth wave of kind of environmental. What are the other waves, and kind of what's the history that brought us to this point?
Well, I think one of the things that has sort of just plagued us in our water management, especially in these highly developed water systems like California and Phoenix and Colorado, where highly variable water supplies and lots of people and changes, is that we've built these water systems piecemeal throughout the years, throughout the last 100 to 150 years, to meet specific needs in specific places. And so we've ended up with sort of a mishmash of different units doing one thing and another doing another, and not really paying that much attention to one another. But one of the more optimistic things that I see is a dramatic increase in collaboration among entities. It's certainly over the last couple of decades, the municipalities, for instance, in California have really done some neat things operating together. There's a really impressive plan among Bay Area water districts, for instance, to be able to trade water from one to another.
Yeah, that's good.
And move water and take advantage of the groundwater storage in the East Bay, for instance, to help relieve pressures. And that increasing that cooperation and also relooking at our facilities and saying this reservoir, it's been operated primarily for water supply for this district for the last 50 years. Maybe if they work with this groundwater district over here and release some of their water during the fall, put it in the groundwater, it might actually allow them to capture more water the following winter because they don't have to release it for the flood.
Yeah, because you're never too full. That won't get to be too full.
And so that cooperation
so interesting.
is really powerful.
It's funny because I remember reading Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner when I was 22 years old, and it just sounds like a totally different world that describes. How politics, makes it possible for these large cities to just get water from these remote areas. How much has changed since that, other than this cooperation between different municipalities?
Well, there's certainly been some significant advances. I can't say that everyone is
Perfect,
being
yeah.
good actors.
Yeah.
There's certainly some factors that are still at work that causes some entity to feel like they're going to be better off if they don't share their information and they don't.
Oh, that's interesting too.
As we got ready for the groundwater, trying to move the groundwater legislation forward, one of the things that became obvious is you could look across the Central Valley and see where there was well data, and there were some certain spots that there wasn't all that much well data available, little blank spots on the map.
Yeah.
But to a great extent, there is
Cooperation
much
and
better
sharing.
communication among the different users. There's associations in California who are really working hard at that to make sure they work together. A group that we work with a good bit is called the Northern California Water Association up in the Sacramento Valley. It's most of the water users in the upper Sacramento Valley. And they've really taken the attitude that we're going to be better off if we talk to all the people, talk to one another, first of all, talk to the other users around us and downstream. Those are pretty powerful interests when you have 24 million people in the Southern California that are needing some water. So we need to work with them and figure out ways where we can proactively plan these things, operate our reservoirs in some sort of a tandem way.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of promising signs in that area, and that's a big part of our work, we feel like, is trying to maximize that, bring the right information in alongside that cooperative attitude, access the funding for it, which is something I haven't mentioned to this point, but providing water in a dry climate takes a lot of resources, and it's a fairly expensive process. We tend to, up to this point, we've paid for the facilities that bring the water from the river or the groundwater to our taps, but we really haven't paid for that natural system, the watersheds and the rivers and streams that bring the water to our diversion.
Right.
And so investing in that natural infrastructure is a really important thing
that's
for us
interesting
going
too.
forward. We need to maintain that so that it continues to provide
So just in the same way that you need to make sure that the pipes and the culverts and all of that part of the water system is cared for, the natural part also requires attention. I think about that a little bit too. I remember growing up in the Central Valley, just this terrible worry about the levee system breaking in earthquakes. And I just wonder too, just how much you think about just kind of disaster preparedness elements and just how vulnerable we are to major disasters.
A really important point in water, and even when you're thinking about water management, you always have to be thinking about those years when the water really comes in a big way. And so the integration of those, how our natural infrastructure carries those floods and handles those floods, and how it behaves for fish and wildlife, and how it behaves for carrying our water in the water supply realm during the drier periods, is a really important point that we have to work on all the time. One of the things that is really valuable, for instance, for flood protection is to move the levees back apart. We tried to squeeze the levees together to keep the rivers in their place. And then in years like last year, you start going, oh, I really wish there was a little more room for that river to spread out. And so moving those levees back, allowing more flood space to convey that water when there's a lot of it.
And if you have these more extreme storm events, then you're going to need that more than you did before too. So again, the global climate change is mixed up in our response to that issue also.
The natural systems throughout history have had to adapt to variable conditions, and they've done that pretty amazingly. Building floodplains that work maybe only once every 5 years, but when they work, and they're really important. And then small lower channels that provide habitat for the fish during the drier years and have cool water in pools. And so we need to think about how those natural systems worked and We're not going to be moving millions of people out of California anytime soon. We still need food and agriculture to supply our food. And so going forward, we need to think about how to mimic some of those natural processes to help us be more resilient
Right.
in the context of all the different demands that we're putting on our water system, our cities, and our food supplies.
Yeah. One of our traditions at the forum is we take questions. So if you would like to include your question in the conversation, Rebecca will collect all your questions. I just saw a Friends documentary on the Eel River up in Northern California, which talked. It was. I wrote down the name of it. A River's Last Chance. And we saw it over in Marin County, and it was a really powerful, almost a spiritual experience for me to see, what the history of that river was from the time when Native Americans cared for it and fished it, to when Europeans first arrived, to just massive logging, and even in the last 30 years, I hadn't been aware of how much cannabis cultivation had affected, what that river looks like. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Eel River in particular, if you know anything about it. I know that kind of the draws on the river are being determined in the next few years. And then also if you could just talk a little bit about cannabis cultivation and just what effect that has on the natural environment.
Very interesting situation. There's a lot of different arguments in the cannabis debate.
Great.
I was sitting there as a hydrologist. I haven't spent a lot of time on the Eel River, although I've admired it many times. It is a magical river.
Magical place.
But when I was with the Nature Conservancy, we did work on the Mattole River up on the north coast. Mm-hmm. Similar sorts of situation, and in this small north coast streams. I could get lost in the amazing hydrology because the variability in the flows of those streams is just dramatic, which causes really unique stream systems, giant gravel bars that cover hundreds of acres at times. And then in most of the summer, there's a winding little small stream going through it. And as I was working on this stream, you could go in the middle of the summer and notice that the water was murky, just fine sediment in it. And sort of inexplicably, usually it'd be really clean, almost, cobalt blue kind of water. And yet, something was disturbing the stream side up in these forests or these ranches. And it turns out, as we've explored it, and others have done some amazing work on trying to identify where that illegal cannabis cultivation is, you would have situations where apparently someone would just pull up with a truck on the side of a road, dump the materials that they needed to set up the cannabis off the side of the road, follow it down into the woods, and set up an operation along some stream with no oversight, no sense of trying to divert water from the stream in a healthy way, heavy use of pesticides. And so many of these small streams were really struggling under cannabis cultivation. And so one outcome that I hope will happen with the legalization of marijuana is that we will be able to manage those who are diverting water from a stream to irrigate this and diminish that unrestricted use of the streams that was clearly very damaging in these systems.
I mean, I was surprised by how destructive it was.
Yeah.
And I guess there's no way to tell what the future will bring, but there's got to be cheaper ways to grow marijuana that's not going to, be so destructive.
Certainly less destructive ways.
Yeah. What is your position on heavy water usage on crops like fruit and nut trees? Should we phase them out of future agricultural industry?
I'm not sure in this case what's being intended by heavy water. I'm wondering if it might be related to fracking and the water that's produced from fracking wells. And that is certainly an issue that we're paying attention to. Environmental Defense Fund is doing some work on that across the West. And it really deserves some careful attention. We are, in California, some areas are using some of that fracking water to irrigate lands in Kern County.
Interesting.
And in general, they're doing a better job than they are in some other places of trying to determine how impactful that is. That said, the water that's coming from these fracking facilities is a wildly varying quality. There are organic materials in there that we really don't even have good analytic procedures for to understand exactly what it is. And so it really deserves careful attention. Our state board is now under the process of developing rules for that. We really encourage them to make that a rigorous process, to do controlled tests to understand what the fate of those materials are. In my career, I've actually worked quite a bit on the reuse of water for irrigation purposes. And in many cases, it can be done safely. It needs to be monitored.
What is the future? Where are we in fracking? I mean, I know it has water implications. It has other implications too. What is the future of that way of extracting resources?
Well, it is happening, and it is happening in a big way. In fact, I just returned from a week in Texas, and we were talking about groundwater and water data for the most part, but the issue of fracking came up over and over. And compared to the level in California, the area out in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico is just overwhelming. It almost takes your breath away to think about it and fly over it, and you see all those pads across. So it is happening. They are finding ways to make it less expensive, to be able to frack in areas that previously weren't cost effective to frack in. And as long as there is a demand for oil, it's going to be really, really difficult to stop those economic drivers that are forcing that. And so it drives home the importance of staying the course on our transition to cleaner energies. And I can't say enough, when you're in the California world and you hear about our push for renewable energy, et cetera, it's a little difficult to sense what that conversation is like in other parts of the world, but it is monumental what California is doing in that realm, and we need to do everything we can.
It just seems so. We could do damage to the earth that we'll never repair just to make gas that we burn in the atmosphere that just speeds up global climate change. It's hard to understand. One question, I come from South Africa. Do you have lessons for us in South Africa about water use, particularly your views on desalination versus managing natural systems?
So I think we probably have a lot to learn from South Africa in some ways, and South Africa has things to learn from us. The basic policies, water policies in South Africa are actually pretty forward-thinking. As they were being developed, they sort of had the benefit, you might say, of developing those in a fairly modern time. And in the 90s and early 2000s, some fairly smart policies were developed in South Africa. Leadership from New Zealand and others who are pretty thoughtful on water. But the policies really aren't implemented all that well. There's, the government is not as effective as you might like it to be. But I think the description that I was giving earlier of thoughtful planning with real information, the best information you have about what the future is going to look like, looking at integrated ways to manage water. Desal is a...
we have two questions about desalination.
Desal is a really important thing to talk about. In places like Cape Town, in places like San Diego, to be resilient, you need a portfolio of water approaches. And so in some cases, desal very much may make sense. It has impacts, and those impacts need to be thoughtfully considered and minimized. But when you think about what's happening in Cape Town at the moment, They are, you might think of, if you look at it on a map, it sort of reminds you a little bit of Monterey, sort of sitting on a peninsula,
Yeah.
out away from most of the rest of the mainland, and Mediterranean climate. And Monterey really doesn't have many water supply options.
Yeah.
They were pumping a lot of their water out of underneath the bed of the Carmel River, and they were drying up the Carmel River,
Yeah.
and they were required to cut back that water supply. And so now they're sort of looking around and saying, oh my, where are we going to have our water supply in the future? And what that's caused them to do is, one, really double down on reuse and reduction of and minimization of use. And they've done some amazing things there. They're also looking at cooperative ways to maybe work with the farmers in the Salinas Valley, which is a little ways away, but not too far away, to try and develop some cooperative things. But
Population just seems like, would there ever be, proposals to limit the population in coastal places like Santa Barbara, Monterey, or San Diego, where we do have such serious water constraints? Is that even part of the conversation anywhere?
It's a little difficult to see in the foreseeable future.
So it's just basically water will get more expensive and people will not move there.
It certainly needs to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
I think, as I was saying earlier, there is still room to improve and reduce the per capita water use for those areas. Los Angeles, for instance, has grown dramatically.
Well, when you said
recent
24
decades.
million people live in Southern California, my heart almost stopped. I was like, I used to remember when the whole state population was 24 million.
Yeah, and Los Angeles has grown dramatically in recent decades, but their water use, their total water use of the city, is really about the same as it was about 20 years ago.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Reducing the amount that is needed to flush a toilet, et cetera. But it's important to recognize that the biggest fraction of the water use in the western U.S. is irrigated agriculture.
Yeah.
Of the human uses of water, still 80% of the water, despite the fact that we have pushing 40 million people, 80% of the human use of water in California is for irrigated agriculture.
Yeah.
And in
And
other
that's what this
states,
question, I think, was really about. It's just like how expensive, how much water different crops use. So, how does that affect just like crop selection?
So a lot of the future is going to require, and it's going to lead to, both economic pressures are going to lead to it, and thoughtful water management, proactive water management is going to lead to more cooperation between agricultural lands and agricultural use of water in cities. It already happens to some extent. It's likely to happen more. And it's going, in the context of our Groundwater Management Act passage, which is going to require dramatic cutbacks in water in some parts of the state, we're going to be looking really hard at things like, should we be growing this crop, which uses maybe 5 feet of water per year, or might there be other crops that we can grow that use half as much water per year? And that's where this idea of water trading can come in. And you could have, for instance, someone who has a really high value crop, really needs, maybe it's an orchard, really needs their water every year, be able to pay someone who is growing a row crop that can turn it off, so to speak, for a year, to use their water for a year. And doing that in a dynamic way, with good
managing
guardrails in
uses, because you're right, like a row crop and a fruit trees, like you just don't have to have steady water for both. Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you for your cascade of information about vital water. Which legislators and NGOs are most effective in leading these concerns, and how about Earth Justice and NRDC? Michael Benet.
So it requires a village. And there are many amazing organizations who are doing work in the water field. I really, one of the groups that we haven't talked much about today is the social justice issue, and the groups that are working on that. They're in the Central Valley,
so
people
talk
like
about
Clean
that
Water
a little bit.
Action and the Community Water Center are doing some great work in trying to make sure that these small disadvantaged communities don't run out of water, and they have clean water that's safe to drink, it's not contaminated with nitrates. And across the spectrum in the environmental world, you have, sometimes litigation is the right answer, and those kinds of tools and the kind of work those organizations do are really valuable. And so figuring out how to move things forward is it's going to take lots of different approaches. With respect to the disadvantaged communities, one of the parts of our work that I'm most excited about is we're teaming with some of these organizations, Rural Community Assistance Center and Self-Help Enterprises, who have been, do really great work in California and parts across the U.S., working in rural communities to help make them sustainable. We partnered with them year before last to do what we call a leadership institute, to train board members of these small community water districts. Most of them volunteered board members that have full-time jobs, tough, hard-working jobs,
exactly.
to be better advocates for their community's water needs. We're repeating that again in the Imperial Valley right now. We're in the midst of a several-week series, and have very high hopes of repeating that in different places in the Central Valley in the coming years. So those types of efforts to help these disadvantaged communities better advocate, understand their needs and advocate for their needs, participate in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation and making sure their needs are heard is a critical part of the overall.
Yeah, that legislation seems like it was so important in terms of just like coordinating the water infrastructure. What other legislation do you see just on the horizon that's important for us to know about?
Well, in May, there will be in June, on the ballot will be a bond measure. The bond measure is primarily focused on urban parks, but there's a considerable amount of funds in there to support water improvements, including, notably, a couple $100 million to address an impending disaster down in the Imperial Valley, the Salton Sea issue, something we worked hard to try and keep in that legislation. That's a funding water infrastructure.
Tell us a little bit about the Salton Sea and just kind of what the situation is. I know little things anecdotally, but.
Yeah, well, the Salton Sea it's an inland basin. It's a low desert, way below sea level. Prior to the early 1900s, it was a dry playa, and there was no water there. But you could go down this story for a long time, so I'll try to be quick. But while they were trying to build a canal to bring water to the valley alongside that playa, the Colorado River flooded, and it actually changed course for a short period of time and flooded the bottom part of the Imperial Valley and formed the Salton Sea. And so in a matter of months and years, it did that. It flowed in there for a couple of years. It went from a dry playa to a big lake. That lake has slowly then, after that period, they finally got the river back in its course. And that lake has slowly gotten more and more saline to the point where it is almost uninhabitable for most fish and wildlife, except there are some really important wetlands along the boundaries of that lake. And the inflows to the lake are primarily return flows from agricultural water use in the Imperial Valley.
Right.
There's 500,000 acres of irrigated land down there. And the Coachella Valley, which is where Palm Springs and Palm Desert are. So the return flows from the water uses there keep that lake from drying up even more quickly than it is. As part of a big water deal, and this is one of those transfers that didn't go exactly as we had hoped, as part of a big water deal between San Diego County Water Authority, Municipal Metropolitan Water District, Southern California, and Imperial Irrigation District, there was a big transfer of water from Imperial through the Colorado River Aqueduct to Metropolitan and a number of users there. And as part of that, the result of that is there's less flows into the Salton Sea, and so the Salton Sea is going to dry up even more quickly than it was, exposing a big area of playa. That is potentially a huge dust
Right,
issue.
of course.
And also impacting that fairly little but very, very critical habitat for migratory birds. And so part of the deal was the state is supposed to address the playa issue and the habitat issues. And the state has been a bit slow in doing that, but recently, thankfully, some real movement on the state taking some proactive measures to control that dust on the playa as the sea recedes and to restore habitat and manage that habitat to provide habitat for the birds. And this funding that's in the bond measure in June
We'll address that too.
is a big start, a good start on funding that effort.
Here's a question. How much water is being used by industry? And just what is the importance of water in industry in California?
So industry uses a good bit of water. But for the most part, most of the industries in California are supplied by municipal water agencies. And so SFPUC, East Bay Mud have industrial customers that are big customers. And in the grand scheme of things, significant but not overwhelming.
Yeah.
That said, the economic value to those industries of their good water supply is really, really important. And so one of the things that environmental defense funds really active in is communicating with those industries where their water is coming from, what the risks are to their water supply, recognizing that they are in this with us.
And important actors.
And ensuring that we have a resilient water supply going forward is really very much in their interest.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's some really thoughtful leaders in the Bay Area that are thinking hard about this and trying to help move some things on water.
Here's a question. In Australia, one of the great challenges we face for water management is working with farmers to change farming practice that rely on heavy water use. How have you worked with farmers in the state? Have there been similar challenges in supporting change?
Now I understand what the heavy water use was, so I apologize for not catching
That's
that
okay.
first time.
Yeah.
A really big part of our work is working with farmers. If we're going to have fish and wildlife going forward in our rivers and streams, it's going to be because we are working together with those different water agencies to proactively plan to have enough water.
Yeah.
And so figuring out ways that farmers can work with us is key to our work. It's key to our work in water, it's key to our work in habitat. And in fact, we found that the farming community is really pretty thoughtful about this. They really want to figure out how they can be good stewards of the land. That's something that's sort of innate in their behavioral, in their behaviors and sort of their social perspectives. And so finding ways where farmers can do things proactively to improve water management and provide habitat is a core part of our work. And we find farmers to be really receptive to that. I mentioned the Northern California Water Association, and just a few weeks ago, I had along with my friend Steve Rothert from the American Rivers, had the opportunity to travel to Yakima, Washington, with a group of farmers from the Sacramento Valley, farmers and water managers from the Sacramento Valley, to see how this process of integrating environmental needs and agricultural needs was working in the Yakima Basin. And there they have formed a new governance for the basin that includes representatives from environmental organizations, state agencies, agricultural water users, and really are shaping a new future for that Yakima Basin. And they have a committee that represents those groups that really is the governance of the basin. And so we were exploring something like that in the Sacramento Basin.
Yeah, it just seems like a much larger system there. That's great to look at like a more optimal size system maybe and seeing what we can learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Do we tax groundwater extracted from private wells? And if not, should we?
So this is a really important point, and something that's, it's something that we don't really like to hear. Our water users don't like to hear that they need to pay more. But as I described, we have huge natural infrastructure That includes the Sierra watersheds. It includes the agricultural lands where water falls on it in the rain and runs off into the river. And it includes these groundwater basins. Now, we didn't build these groundwater basins. Those have been built through the eons. We didn't have to invest in them, but we do need to invest in managing them.
Right.
Doing recharge, monitoring to make sure the contamination is not getting worse, managing our water use, and so it costs. And right now, there is no cost specifically in most places for pumping groundwater. You pay the cost of operating the well, whether it's run by diesel or electric, but you don't pay for any of that water. And with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in place, these sustainability agencies that have been formed in the intervening years do have the authority to charge a fee for water use. That said, it's really politically not very appealing to do that, but in fact, it's urgently needed.
Yeah.
As I said, we are really not paying the true cost
Exactly.
of maintaining our water supply.
Yeah.
And so although it doesn't cost a lot when you think about a unit of water, it's important that we begin to pay.
Yeah, and it allocates the cost in an honest way, because whether you have snowmelt that's coming down, through the Sacramento River, and that's water. If you keep pumping it out of a field in Lodi, that's water too, and they should be treated similarly, in order for us to make good decisions about what's best for the environment.
Right, to manage that going forward.
Is there a role for gray water use in urban and rural areas? Oh, this is interesting. How do you control water stealing when one farmer has 20,000-foot well and the neighbor drills a 50,000-foot well stealing water from the aquifer?
Well, there's a few different questions in there.
Yeah. Well, there's another one after this, too.
With respect to the gray water, that's certainly a reasonable part of a portfolio for water management, and that can be done on individual scales. It can also be done on large city scales, and in fact, we're doing quite a bit of that. Some in Southern California, where they're depending on the Colorado River and the Delta just east of here, for 2/3 of their water supply. The least expensive water supplies in many areas is to reuse in a big scale.
Yeah.
And so it's, in a way, it's sort of gray water use, but at a municipal level, collecting that wastewater, treating it, and resupplying it in different ways as the water supply for the communities.
Yeah.
So it's certainly part of a portfolio.
And then stealing.
So the stealing part of water, that's a real big challenge in groundwater management. Groundwater has tended to be treated as a open pool
Free
resource.
good. Yeah.
And whoever has the deepest well wins. That's a phrase that we used a good bit as we were trying to push the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act forward. The way you guard against that is you have someone watching the ship in the long term. And if you, and there's not any one specific tool to do that, but to set objectives for what the levels need to be maintained in your groundwater, and then allow certain users to pump only as much as you can do with that, under that limit.
Right.
Is part of the measure, and sometimes you may be able to proactively recharge the groundwater to compensate for over-pumping in one particular area. But it is, I wouldn't necessarily call it stealing, but it certainly had, the setup up to this point has been so that that person with the resources, that user with the resources to drill a deeper well can literally dry up the wells of their neighbors, and it's happened time and time again.
Yeah. The last person person points out is dietary needs. Just educating the youth that a cow needs 30 gallons for daily change, and an almond tree needs 10 gallons, and there's a little bit more here, but thank you. Does a pipeline system exist to convey water from the eastern states to the western states? If not, are there plans to build one?
If you start at Colorado and go west, there isn't a pipeline that brings water from the east to the west.
Yeah.
In some ways, you might think a little bit of the Colorado River as something like that pipeline, because it starts in Colorado and southwestern Wyoming and brings water all the way down to,
Right.
in fact, city of San Diego. When you drink water in San Diego, you're drinking some water that ran off the slopes of the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. But the idea of bringing water from the Great Lakes or from the Mississippi to the west has been talked about, and some other amazingly innovative things have been talked about, like bladders that rest in the ocean out at the mouth of the Columbia River to catch fresh water and then tow them down to Southern California have been talked about, and a pipeline across Oregon from the Columbia.
Right, of course. That was one of the things that Mark Reisner was so frightened of, that we'd get water, Los Angeles would get water from Washington State.
So those things have been talked about, but at this point, something like that really isn't cost effective.
Yeah.
There are other ways to make water available, reuse, water trading and water transfers. And generally the perspective in the water community these days is that regional solutions are preferred. There is so much challenge and political instability around moving water large distances, that to introduce more of that into our system is really probably not a good idea.
Yeah, that's what I thought you might say. I have to preach a sermon now, so that's why we're
I thought we were preaching a sermon.
Yeah. Well, you've preached your sermon. Now it's my turn to be mine. I liked your sermon better, by the way.
Well,
But as we leave, I mean, we've learned so much. I mean, just about where our water comes from, what are some threats to it, what global climate change, how that's going to affect things. I feel really reassured. I feel like a lot of very bright people are working on these problems. It's not like we're going to do something too terribly stupid because people are addressing this. But I wonder what more you need us to know, just as citizens and just as people who are wise human beings who are trying to understand the truth about the world.
well, I think we are moving in a good direction. We have some really good ideas. We have improving technology, and we're starting to make really good use of that. The thing that I really worry the most about is, can we move fast enough to, in particular, avoid severe impacts to these ecological systems that, have basically survived in many cases on what's left over once we've taken it for our cities and agriculture. So moving quickly enough, and I think perhaps in the vein of your truth theme, I think perhaps the biggest threat to that is misinformation and a lack of clarity and interest trying to slow things down, trying to disrupt progress by taking advantage of that idea of giving people what they want to hear.
Right,
Things like the salmon are the reason that there's not enough, or the smelt are the reason that there's not enough water in the Central Valley. And those types of things really just distract from getting the work done. And so the most important thing, and probably the biggest obstacle to progress in my mind, is having different views of the situation. And so we have to try to dispel these myths, get beyond these myths, so that we can have a conversation about what is the real problem and how can we work together to solve it.
So misinformation is the most serious problem that we
I
face.
really think so.
And I can imagine, just because what you're describing is just an ability to coordinate vast amounts of space with experts in different fields, and I can see that misinformation would be the most serious, challenge. And you're right, the stakes are so high. I mean, once you really kill off the Eel River, you're just never going to get back what we had before. Well, we're so grateful to have you.
It's a real
Maurice
treat
Hall.
to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Next week, we're going to be talking to Sasha Abramsky. I've been reading his book about fear, and it's connected to this too. Basically, what his thesis is that these new technologies are making us much more afraid all the time, and definitely misinformation is part of that whole thing. But we're so glad for what you had to offer for us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week at 9 o'clock. The service is at 11 o'clock, and you're welcome to join us for that too. Thanks so much, Maurice.
Thank you.
It's so nice to meet you.